Hello and welcome everyone. Wonderful to be with you here today in some form. My name is Easton-Calabria. I'm a senior research officer at the Refugee Studies Center, and I'm convening this Trinity Terms seminar series on localizing refugee research and practice. And today I have the great pleasure to introduce Professor Giorgia Donà, who's the co-director of the Center for Migration, Refugees and Belonging at the University of East London. And before I turn it over to you, Giorgia, I have just one quick bit of housekeeping for our audience. So you'll see that the chat function is disabled, but the Q&A function is ready and waiting for you. So at any point during the talk or afterwards, please type in a question and I will do my best to do it justice during our conversation after the talk. So with that, I will turn it over to Giorgia and I will be back in about half an hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Evan, for the invitation and for the opportunity to give a talk this evening. And I hope that I've now shared my PowerPoint and you can all see it. So what I would like to do this evening is for us to think together around digital methodologies in forced migration and refugee research and rethinking voices, representation and power. Now, let me start with a preamble, which is that in 2007, I wrote a paper titled The Microphysics of Participation in Refugee Research, which was published in the Journal of Refugee Studies. Issues that are relevant today of participation as a method in research with and for refugees, but also more broadly at participatory research as an approach, and the dissemination of refugee voices and representation in knowledge formation. The argument I made in that paper was to show that we need to think about participation through what I borrowed from Foucault's microphysics of power, through this kind of network of relationships among a whole range of stakeholders that include not only participants and researchers, but also funding bodies, policy think tanks, NGOs, and a whole range of other stakeholders and participants. And I try to argue that power circulates around this kind of networks, and we need to think of participation in those terms. So it is with kind of pleasure that I've used this presentation as an opportunity for me to rethink participation and power relations in knowledge formation, when it comes to using the digital and thinking about digital transformations in social life and social research, which is embedded in social life, that is rapidly occurring nowadays. And with COVID, we have seen this kind of digital transformation being accelerated, but also in the ways in which my research has kind of tried to think around the digital. And I think that is quite relevant for the seminar series that looks at, again, localization agenda and kind of thinks around issues of participation, power relations, and recentering and decentering production and action. But it's also relevant for us located in different spaces, in my case, like a university, where there are conversations around knowledge and research and who is acting in these spheres through the colonial praxis. And I'll mention that towards the end of my presentation. So let me start then by looking at the digital in forced migration and refugee studies and trying to trace very, very briefly a change that has occurred since I published my paper and in the last 2 decades has accelerated from that I describe as a shift from connected migrants to digital forced migration studies. So Di Minesco, at the beginning of this century, focused on the ways in which migrants are connected and how they use technologies to create online communities, what are described as e-diasporas were described. And this represents quite a shift from the notion of migrants in that case, and refugees in our case, and forced migrants as individuals who are uprooted and separated from home, towards an understanding of their connective online presence in diasporic settings. But we have moved on from that idea of connected migrants to examine and consider more directly how the lives of migrants, forced migrants, and displaced populations are increasingly mediated digitally. such that digital technologies are becoming part of everyday life in terms of relationships, interactions with service provision, with humanitarian sector, etc., etc. And Marigo and I describe this as kind of digital technologies for belonging in the context of those who can make a belonging, but also for survival, for the increasing numbers who live in situations of precariousness and also keep crossing the Mediterranean or the world and are in transit. But we have, again, this kind of shift has accelerated to the degree that Lors and Nets in 2018 have pointed out that when we think of migration studies, we probably need to see it also as an emerging field of digital migration studies, because digital technologies play an important role in the everyday lives of migrants and forced migrants and in the governmentality of mobility. So it is with this kind of shift from connecting migrants to digital migration and forced migration studies that I like for us to kind of reflect and situate some of the conversation around digital methodologies in what is, I would say, as my field of migration and refugee research. As I said earlier, our research and the collection of information, whether it's through consultancy, through academic fora, through applied and impactful research, as it is being called nowadays, is part of broader social life. And it is in this context that we need to understand that the production of knowledge and data that we produce is actually part of a much broader change in the world we live in, where big data is everywhere, and it's produced by users. We constantly produce data, as we know. We co-produce content in all the multiple platforms which we occupy, which is interactive, which is constantly updated, and is being managed by the world of algorithms. So what is the digital then in this kind of broader world of knowledge formation, production, and reproduction? And how is it relevant and how is it shaped in the field of forced migration and refugee studies? And I like to think of the digital in kind of three ways. Both the digital as an object of inquiry, how are migrants' digital lives being researched and understood, and the changes that occur in their lives, and also their digital interactions with a whole range of humanitarian, political, and other actors. Also, I want to think of the digital in terms of digital methods, as we understand conventionally in techniques and ways of relating to participants, collecting information, but also the digital in terms of dissemination and the multiple platforms that are present everywhere and in which we operate. So let me start then by giving you a couple of examples from my recent research that looks at the digital, so that we can, again, you can begin to see where I'm coming from through examples and case studies. So let me think of the digital in terms of the object of inquiry. And in order to do so, I'm relying on a recent project that we concluded in partnership with Missing Children Europe, which looks at the Manila app for young unaccompanied minors and children in transit across Europe. So we were asked to do an impact evaluation of how the application works. So again, what is interesting for us in terms of a localization agenda, how information is being shared and produced, is that we have an application that is being created, Manila app, that is being present across Europe, is being relies on a range of transnational actors, both local, national, and transnationals, to provide information, resources on all sorts of services that are available, policies that are present in different countries. So there is a co-production of information that is constantly and dynamically updated and changing, that is then promoted through NGOs and other organizations to migrants and young migrants in particular who are transiting across Europe, and is being presented in a user-friendly way so that they can access this information as they cross or even as they settle in a country. The point I'm making here is that the use of online resources and the digitization of the provision of information is become part of an object of inquiry, but also part of our everyday life in understanding the lives of, in this case, young migrants. So when we did our impact study, we saw that young migrants are appreciating this new way of providing information. So I give just a quote from Shireen, who is 15 years old and is in Greece. So what he says is, when I saw this application and installed it, it is a very useful tool because there is information about clothes, about the doctor, about mental support, about food, these kinds of services. So in this interaction between young migrants crossing Europe, their access to resources, what emerged is that these new ways of digitizing service provision is useful and appreciated. However, is also limited in that one of the ways in which we understood the information we received from participants, both young minors and national coordinators, partners, and Missing Children Europe, was that the application in itself, this digitization of knowledge, is not sufficient. It requires a human element and it requires human labor. So that it requires a range of members of NGOs to upload the information about the organizations, to make time to update it, to let young migrants know that the application exists, to disseminate the application to other organizations and potential users. So that one of the findings was that the more people use the app, the better it is going to be. So it relies on this, again, user input and NGOs partners input, which is ongoing and constant to be able to be maintained and usable. And what is interesting now, as I step back and I think about our impact case study and our role as researchers in this landscape of knowledge, formation, production, and evaluation, is that when we interacted with the different partners, when we gave presentations, when we had conversations with a whole range of NGOs across Europe, what emerged is that we were encouraging this digital sharing of data. So we became part of this landscape and we were providing information and becoming co-authors and co-producers, suggesting what audio files could be added, what languages and symbols could be included, what information could be extended and expanded. So that we became, our position as researchers became embedded in this landscape of knowledge, formation and production. But also what emerged, and it emerges even more in the next study, is that our interviews, of course, taking place during lockdown, all took place online. So some of the ways in which we conducted the interviews, group discussions, and the collection of information was also mediated and became part of this, again, landscape of online digital production of information and reproduction of this information and dissemination. So then, having discussed very briefly this idea of the digital as in terms of production of knowledge and this changing landscape of collaborative input into knowledge production, I want to move on to another study with it, which for me emphasizes another element that, again, shows the blurring of boundaries between this formation of knowledge across let's say researchers, NGOs, partners, and users. And I want to focus in the next example specifically on relationships that have changed as we move on into the digital sphere. So the second study that I'm going to share with you is a study on the digitization of the charity humanitarian sector that shows the tensions that exist between digital methodologies, digital knowledge formation, digital provision of services versus reality. So this was a study that was commissioned by and funded by a network of partners that are interested in exploring the ways in which advanced digital technologies are being used in the charity sector. And this is particularly relevant because in the context of COVID, many organizations, many charities have changed and their service provision and have moved online. And in this case, we are in partnership with the Refugee Council, we are examining how digital service provision for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in the UK has changed and what tensions emerge in this relationship between service providers, service users, and researchers. So what the main kind of key findings of this kind of study on digital social protection, as we call it, is that there is a tension, so that during lockdown, moving to all these online platforms that we are all familiar with, whether it's Zoom, Teams, or Google, had increased access to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in remote areas that would not necessarily have access to education, social gatherings, language trainings, etc., and enabled an ongoing support and sharing of information for those who were locked in temporary accommodation or in foster families. However, it also revealed a degree of digital inequality, because for those who were in foster care, access to internet, Wi-Fi, and data packages was easy. But for those who were in temporary accommodation, relying on data packages and sometimes in the asylum system not having access to Wi-Fi, the the ability to be able to benefit from this provision was limited. It also revealed that digital literacy was varied among staff and clients of the center, and there were disparities in funding and lack of funding for digital services. So while we, again, notice this tension in real life between the digital and the real in the provision of support for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, we also, as, again, researchers and partners, because one of the researchers in the project also worked at the Refugee Council, we had this internal conversation that also revealed, like as us, as researchers, we're encountering exactly the same tensions in our research approach, so that we could access more participants, we could provide some support, but we also experience inequality and illiteracy across different range of participants using different platforms. What that meant and what helped us to reflect upon is how relationships in the provision of services, but also in research that are mediated digitally, are quite similar. So what we found out in this study was that both unaccompanied minors and staff at the Refugee Council were commenting on the ways in which online provision of services was important, because it allowed to maintain relationships and build relationships. But there were also limitations, especially because in order to create a good service, you need to understand the needs of the children. Therefore, you need to, all clients, or in the context of humanitarian work, the beneficiaries, and you need to build that trust, which takes place usually through formal and informal interactions that occur before a meeting, after a meeting, in real life take place when a youth worker takes a child to visit a doctor, and so on and so on. So all these kind of informal, outside the digital space interactions were not available. But also in the digital service provision, nonverbal behaviors, nonverbal cues are key. And understanding if somebody is distressed, or understanding if there are, if the information that is given is full or not, was limited by the use of online platforms. There were also other issues around trust and privacy, because by using online platforms, it was not understandable if children had safe spaces where they could talk, where nobody was listening, or if they were sharing a room or accommodation with other people. So like somebody from the Refugee Council said, and I'm quoting, "Things like safeguarding issues are much easier to spot in person, because you can see someone's behavior as well as what they're telling you. The first time you speak with someone, they're not usually just going to share lots of stuff off the bat." And again, what is interesting is that these comments that staff were making, and young unaccompanied asylum-seeking children were also making, pointed to a tension. And again, looking at the digital in the provision of services, in understanding the needs of those clients who are in particular vulnerable or difficult situations, is also reproduced in, again, like in the previous study, in our research methodologies that, because of COVID, use digital methods to select participants, to interact with participants, to have conversations, and to, again, to develop relationships of trust. And we found out that what I just mentioned, building relationships, having trust, this pre and post informal conversations, picking up on nonverbal behaviors, trust and privacy, were also part of our digital methodological questions and strengths, but also limitations of our research. I now want to move on. So having kind of focused on co-production and content, the relationships, I want to move on to another study, which raises another issue that pertains the relationship between the digital research and real life. And I'm now going to draw on a piece of research that I did with Marie Godin, where we looked at the role of new social media and the politics of representation in examining refugee voices. For this piece of research, we conducted both kind of online networking, ethnography, but also on offline interviews with members of Congolese Action Youth Platform. And I have to thank Marie for being quite embedded in that network and having access to a whole range of participants, but also having very insightful conversations. And what is interesting in this kind of project is that the young Congolese refugees exercise agency in doing their own research. So they research the history of their country. They discovered that there was a particular date which was not recognized, but it was important for understanding conflict in the region in the 2nd of August. And then they created a site to disseminate that information, creating memorial events and kind of sharing the knowledge. We can see that this example is an example of participatory action research, where there is agency by refugees themselves, which is exercised in the creation of an analytical voice, but also an activist voice that promotes counter-hegemonic narratives of violence, in this case, in the Eastern Democratic of Congo. In a similar way, we also looked at the story of another kind of young Congolese who is a poet and reflected on his experience of being a refugee and wanted to represent his experience aesthetically through a poem that not only he created, but also took control in producing online and reproducing and disseminating. So we can see again here another example of the ways in which an aesthetic expression is performed online and offline to reveal an agency through authorship, but also ownership of one's voice. And this is possible because of, again, this emerging plethora of social media platforms that allow people to have these more direct ways of researching information, but also producing, authoring, and owning the information and its dissemination. So what we kind of reflecting upon on these two case studies, we kind of problematize this idea of representation that in a way challenges, through the use of social media, these stories in a way challenge the individualistic, depoliticized, decontextualized, and aestheticized representation of the refugee diasporic voice, whether it's through the lens of victim or threat or humanitarian person in need, the vulnerable, and so on and so on. And it enables, in a way, refugees and diaspora members to exercise agency, in, as I said, in the creation, production, and dissemination of their voices. And again, these new platforms of ownership shift the relationships between conventional researchers, who now occupy more like the space of documenting an existing research process, which is led by young migrants and refugees, rather than being in control of the data collection and its dissemination. So what I've attempted to do in this first part of my presentation is to give you some examples of the ways in which the digital is embedded in the lives of everybody, including those who are forced to move and leave their countries. It is also embedded in our methodologies and our research. So I've tried to give some examples of the ways in which the digital has a role to play in unpacking the relationship between forced migrants' everyday digitally mediated lives and research that takes place with, on, for, or by forced migrants. And it is in this new landscape of what some people would say is an emerging field of digital forced migration and refugee studies that we are kind of repositioning ourselves in terms of our methods, our relationships, but also more broadly, issues of voice representation, power dynamics, and ultimately this co-creation of data and knowledge in a world that is where data is, as people say, becoming the new gold, the new value asset, the asset that we all want. And I want, therefore, to move this kind of thinking around issues of digital forced migration and digital methodologies in forced migration to this broader kind of landscape for us to reflect briefly on where our kind of knowledge and where these new digital platforms, methodologies take us at this particular historical junction. And I want to again raise the thinking at a more general level, because I think that there is something quite extraordinary happening at this particular point in time, where we have a digital, but we also have a whole other set of conversations that are breaking down hegemonic understanding and are challenging conventional understanding of racialized and gendered lives, of migration, etc., etc. And these are framed both through an attempt by many, maybe some states, to control this information and have more securitization and surveillance that in a way resemble colonial ways of administering, controlling the movement and the lives of people, but also this new emerging kind of movement of decolonizing the university and decolonizing maybe forced migration and refugee studies, and reflecting around the histories that we are embedded in, to which our research has contributed over time. So I want to move then to this more broader kind of digital coloniality, so to speak, that looks at the ways in which in the past, some elements of colonial practices of the past can be seen, filtered through the ways in which data and the digital and big data is being used to monitor and control the lives of those who cross borders. So we know that the systematic counting of bodies under colonial regimes is reinscribed as data and information flows in the governmentality of mobility. This is visible, for instance, in the ways in which the body of those who cross borders is being transformed into data that is being input in databases across Fortress Europe. And big data is being used to categorize, order, and segregate lives like in the past, while one could argue, like Ajana and Fuller have done, that current biometric systems that are being used frequently to, in a way, to monitor the movements of people who cross borders are trialed on those who have fewer rights before they're being spilled over to the rest of us. That kind of is reminiscent of the ways in which in colonial times certain administrative ordering practices were being first trialed on the colonized. And these techniques becomes a way of normalized difference in a new world order. This also, again, raises interesting questions around voice and representation. And Chun in 2006 wrote a text that is titled High-Tech Orientalism, which in a way frames the appearance of digitally connected refugees or migrants as incompatible with Eurocentric expectations of suffering and the poor refugees. And this, again, for those of us who, remember when Syrians cross the border and reach Greece and they're taking out their mobile phones, many people were saying then they cannot be refugees. This is an example of high-tech Orientalism. But also in the context of the Black Mediterranean and the crossing and the death of so many bodies, there are reminiscent kind of, there is a reminiscence of the Black Atlantic and the crossing of people who are then controlled and monitored by power, according to Di Maio, so that there is a power that politicians, police, military have over refugees in determining their everyday experience as they cross border and existence. So this is visible, and these are just some examples of in the system of digital securitization, and I would say sometimes also humanitarianism, that is increasingly using the giving of data, the production of data, to create a whole kind of new spectrum of big data and digital surveillance and humanitarianism. So examples of this would be Eurodac, biometric information at the border that stores the fingerprints of asylum seekers and migrants, reinforcing internal and external borders. to the identification of individuals. It's visible in risk profiling used as a means of digital governance, segregating legitimate mobility, such as leisure and business, from illegitimate ones, such as terrorism and undocumented migration. It's visible in the iris guard scanner that is being used to withdraw cash entitlements among refugees in camps in the Middle East, that again record their iris, their imprint, digital, leaves a digital imprint in the system in order for them to access humanitarian aid. And it's also present in the UNHCR Progress database that has a digital record, global record for every refugee containing their personal details, contact information, place of origin, time of arrival, etc., across more than 70 countries. So again, because our research is connected to life outside, the digital and research and the creation of this data is something that we need to study, but it's also something that we need to reflect upon as to how we contribute and in what way to this, digital collection of data globally. So there are some questions that I've been kind of puzzled by, that I've been thinking about more and more. I'm thinking about, in recent times, which is, how is the data that I'm collecting, or we are collecting, used in the world of big data? Is my research, does our research unconsciously partake in this digital coloniality, and in what ways? So digital methodologies can be used to produce, reproduce, and maintain unequal power relations, but also they can help us to rethink refugee voices, representation, and power within this kind of another growing movement that calls for decolonizing forced migration and refugee studies. So we can see that there is, in my opinion, I would say, a tension between the use of the digital and the acquisition of data by a whole range of social actors, a network of stakeholders, of which researchers are just one part, one element. And in all this kind of acquisition of big data, acquisition of data, dissemination of data on online platforms, where are we situated? So are we partaking into some measures that exercise control and disempower and create an equal power relationship to digital inequalities in refugee and forced migrants' lives? Or are we, in a way, trying to think and reposition ourselves within the other movement, which calls for breaking down of this hegemony, but also unpacking some of these new ways in which big data is connected, and the neutrality of the algorithm in profiling people of racialized and gendered characteristics? And I want to, in a way, conclude this last part of my, in a way, to come to the last part of my presentation by sharing with you our thinking that is taking place at the University of East London, of which I'm a member of, that tries to reflect on these broader issues of knowledge production, the digital education, and also our place within the university. So few of us have been involved for a number of years in a project that is called Educating Across Borders. So Educating Across Borders refers to the idea that there should be a university for all those who want to access education. And Educating Across Borders aims to support young refugees to access higher education, in this case, our university, but other settings across contexts of conflict, displacement, and exile, irrespective of borders. And it is situated within this new decolonial and critical theory approaches to knowledge formation as practice. So our research is also part of our teaching that tries to decenter hegemonic histories and calls into question existing power relations among researchers, teachers, participants, and learners. And we look at this space, this new space of, in a way, formation of knowledge, sharing of knowledge, as in the space we occupy, the university, as what Mbembe described as a pluri-university, pluriversity, which is supported by and supporting a variety of forms of refugees' political organizing, whether it's humanitarian, rights-based, cooperative, reciprocal, commons-based, associational, and also tries to look at kind of critical and altered politics of higher education. And I would say that when we started this project in the what used to be called the Calais jungle, we I had this amazing colleague, Connie Squire, who led this project and offered narrative research trainings to migrants in transit. And for us, they were learners. And through that project, we taught them how narratives research and multimodal research. And at the end of the project, we looked at their stories, and a book that is, you can see on the left-hand side, Voices from the Jungle, came out with their kind of, which is authored by them. So it is in this kind of space of the border where we try to bring our university. But I think that the greatest success of our plural university is that we managed to get people without documents to receive certificates, thus challenging the border regime that is present in higher education in the UK. So our model, which we call Omni model, is open, accessible, multimodal, using different holistic psychosocial issues, academic teaching, lectures, tutorials, but also arts, literature, yoga, and IT, is narrative based on refugee-centered stories and inclusive across gender, sexualities, age, countries of origin. We are attempting to create this kind of position. Of course, there are challenges, and it's not perfect, as we all know, because it's always a struggle, and the digital plays part of it. And this is why I want to now give you an example of how the digital and how our digital methodologies as practiced, both in terms of research and teaching combined, are unfolding in this landscape that we try to occupy. So we have developed what we call digital storytelling action research, which consists in this case of, it started as a partnership between ourselves and a Mosaic educational NGO that works with young refugees and across in the Middle East, in Lebanon and Jordan. And as part of that, we gave online trainings to student ambassadors that help them to reflect on their educational journeys, their migrant journeys, but also give them training on research methods, on digital research methodologies, on ethics, safeguarding, informed consent, narrative skills, as well as an understanding of intersectional power relations around gender, psychosocial support. The young student ambassadors received this training, and then they would, in what is conventionally kind of participatory or action research, they would use their knowledge to become peers and collect stories from other refugee students. And their stories were then digitized and became part of what was a Facebook share platform called Darda Chat, which has a whole range of young people across the region who are interested in learning more about higher education, the struggles, the challenges, the scholarships, the experiences. And these narratives were then shared on this platform to create a student-led kind of content that then was broadcast live through Facebooks and videos and was used as a way to follow up with local meetings. But again, this use of the digital in terms of the provision of the training, the collection of data, but also the sharing of data, I think is important for us because it kind of repositions our role as not only researchers, but teachers, but also as those who are part of this kind of digital landscape where information can be shared by young people themselves. And again, and looking at the comments and the likes and the kind of ongoing interactive sharing of information is also something that is part of our kind of digital understanding of the current world we live in. So to conclude, I have tried to give you some examples of my current thinking on the role of the digital at this particular historic conjuncture, which I think is quite important. So I think that we are living not only in a time where the digital has become part of our daily life, and there has been an acceleration through the global pandemic of the use of the digital, but also it is in this new kind of configuration and historic conjunction that our understanding of knowledge formation and reproduction is also challenged. So we see that in addition to COVID, we've also experienced in the last year this emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Roads must fall movements, decolonizing the university, and one could say that this conversation around localization agenda are also part of these ways in which the world is trying to reconfigure itself and its power relationships, and it's who produces knowledge, who has access to what resources, who is participating in what conversations. And this is why, for those of us who are in the field of forced migration and refugee studies, I think it's quite interesting to see how we are positioned in these broader discussions and what role the digital has. So in terms of asking questions, what is that we are researching? Who are we contacting? How and to what end? And I don't have the answers, of course, but I found it interesting to go through this kind of thinking journey, thanks to the opportunity to give this talk today. And looking back at my original paper, which is now almost 15 years old, I came to kind of the conclusion that when I, again, look at that paper and I look at participation and I look at these conversations around who are the participants, what are the research relationships, who is producing which knowledge, I would say that the current landscape is kind of challenging some of our conventional ways of working and the binaries that we have been working with, and is breaking them down so that there is more voices are being heard, but then what voices are being heard in the landscape of noise that is present now. But also in terms of representation, we know that, again, the digital is changing the ways in which forced migrants are representing themselves, and how they're being repositioned. But ultimately, again, power relations are still at the core. So in the same way in which in 2007, I argued that the circulation of power needs to be unpacked to understand what goes on in research processes, I would still argue that through the digital, many ways of working have changed, but not surprisingly, the issue of power is still at the core of these changes and understanding of the world we live in. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And I have a list of resources. If some of you are interested, you can contact me and I can send them to you. Thank you.
Great, Giorgia, thank you so much. I'm not sure, are you able to stop screen sharing?
Yes.
Perfect. That's always the hardest part for me, to find that bit. Thank you for the amazing, wide-ranging scope in your talk. That was incredible in terms of what you managed to touch on.